Good evening and welcome. Before we begin, take a little time to arrive. Set down whatever the day has left in your hands. Dim the lights if you like, and let the room grow simple around you. There is nothing to follow closely tonight, nothing to memorize, and no moment where you will be asked to catch up. This is a long, quiet story, and it will go on at its own pace whether you stay for all of it or slip away somewhere in the middle. Either way is fine. Either way, it will consider its work done. Tonight's story is built a little differently from the ones we usually tell beside this fire. On other evenings, we have watched great fortunes from above, whole dynasties crossing a century, whole ledgers opening and closing, generations rising and falling like weather. Tonight, we are going to do something smaller and perhaps gentler. We are going to spend one single day inside an empire, one ordinary Tuesday, from the dark before dawn to midnight, moving through it floor by floor and hour by hour, the way the people who actually kept it running moved through it. The empire is the one Frank Woolworth built out of the smallest coins anyone carried. The 5 and 10 cent store. The red-fronted palace of nickels and dimes that once stood on the main street of nearly every town in America, and has now vanished from every one of them. Folded inside our single day, the whole story will be waiting. The farm boy who could not sell, the store that failed and the store that did not, the 600 red storefronts, the tallest building on earth paid for entirely in cash. And then on the far side of the day, the slow vanishing, the granddaughter the newspapers called the poor little rich girl, the last lunch counter, and the summer evening in 1997, when the final American Woolworth stores turned off their lights for good. It is all true, as best as history can tell it. The numbers rounded gently and flagged where they are estimates, the legends framed as legends. And it asks nothing of you except that you listen for as long as you care to. So, let us wind the clock back and choose our day. Most histories of money are told from a great height. You look down on a century as if from a balloon, here the founder, there the merger, over there the decline, and the people below are the size of ants, and their mornings and afternoons disappear entirely. That is a fine way to understand a fortune, and we have told stories that way on other evenings. But it misses the one thing a fortune actually is, hour by hour while it is alive. A fortune is people getting up in the dark. It is keys turning in locks, coins counted into drawers, floor swept, crates opened, lamps lit, and lamps put out. An empire, seen from inside, is simply an enormous number of ordinary days laid end to end. So tonight, we will take one of them. Let us imagine a Tuesday in the spring of 1913, an ordinary day, assembled from the ordinary records such days left behind. That is what this is, and it is only fair to say so plainly. No diary survives of this exact day, because there was nothing about it worth writing down, which is precisely why we are choosing it. But the trade papers, the store manuals, the letters, the photographs, the ledgers, the memories that clerks and managers set down years later, all of these tell us in detail what such a Tuesday held. We will invent no people and put words in no one's mouth. The stock boy, the counter girls, the buyer, the night watchman, they are the people the records describe, with the particulars gently smoothed. And when Frank Woolworth himself walks through a scene, he will be doing things the witnesses of his life actually saw him do. We have chosen the spring of 1913 because the empire that season stood at the exact top of its arc. There were by that spring more than 600 stores flying the red and gold sign in mill towns and county seats, great cities, in Canada and in England, where the first British branches had opened a few years before. The founder was 60 years old, the most successful merchant alive by many measures. And in Lower Manhattan, a tower faced in cream-colored terracotta had just risen higher than any building human beings had ever made. His tower, bought with nickels, owing not $1 to any bank. In a few weeks, the President of the United States would press a button in Washington and light it up like a lantern. None of the people in our Tuesday know what we know. They do not know that the nickel itself will one day buy nothing. They do not know about the granddaughter, or the shuttered lunch counters, or the sign coming down from the last store on the last day. They know only their own hours, and for one night we will keep them company through those hours, and let the rest of the story come and go like weather on the horizon. The day begins as retail days have always begun, in the dark. 4 o'clock in a town we will leave unnamed, because there were some 600 to choose from, and on a Tuesday in 1913 they all began the same way. Main Street is silent. The arc lamps hiss at the corners. Somewhere behind the shuttered face of the 5 and 10, a side door opens and a lantern moves through the stockroom, and the day's first work begins among the crates. Breathe in, and you can build the room around you. Raw wood and packing straw. The sweet, dusty smell of penny candy in its pails. Kerosene twined cardboard. And underneath it all, every American alive that year would have recognized with their eyes closed. The dark, oiled wooden floor of a dime store, something between creosote and furniture polish. A smell that lingered in the coats of the people who worked there and followed them home. The crates came in by rail, and their labels read like a quiet atlas. Glass Christmas ornaments from the German mountain village of Lauscha, where whole families blew and silvered them at home by lamplight. Dolls from Sonneberg. Harmonicas from Saxony. Crockery from the English potteries. And alongside them, the American freight, enamelware and hairpins, tin toys and pocket knives, writing tablets, thread, soap, sheet music. The stock boy's crowbar squeals against the nails, the lid lifts, the straw is swept aside, and there in the lantern light is the whole secret of the fortune, ordinary things in extraordinary quantities. Because here, in the cold stockroom, is where the arithmetic of the nickel lives, so let us take it apart gently once, and then it will run beneath the rest of the night on its own. A tin pail that cost the company perhaps 3 cents sold for 5. A dish that cost 6 or 7 cents sold for 10. On any single sale, the margin was a breath, a penny or two, thinner than any respectable merchant of the old school would have gotten out of bed for. The fortune was never in the margin. It was in the multiplication. Sell the pail not once but 100,000 times in 600 stores, week after week, and the pennies become a river. Buy for cash in quantities no one had ever ordered before, and the factories will shave their prices to keep your business. Sell for cash and there are no ledgers of credit, no bad debts, no favors. The nickel empire was built on exactly this, the shortest distance ever drawn between a factory and a customer's hand. And as the stock boy works, we can let the room remember how it all started, because the man whose name is on the window learned this arithmetic the hard way. Frank Woolworth was born in 1852 on a farm in upstate New York near Watertown, in country where the winters were long and the potato rows were longer. He hated farming with a quiet, total hatred, and at 21 he talked his way into a clerkship at a dry goods store in Watertown, working for the first 3 months for nothing at all, because the owners judged reasonably that he was worth about that much. By every account, including his own cheerful admission in later years, he was a hopeless salesman. He could not talk customers into anything. What he could do, the one gift that turned out to matter, was arrange things. Give him a window, a counter, a bin of oddments, and he would build a display that sold the goods without a single word being spoken. Then in 1878, the store found itself overstocked, and word was going around the trade of a curious experiment, a table where every item cost 5 cents, no more, no less, no haggling. Frank's employers let him try one. The table sold down to the bare wood, and the unsalesman felt the ground shift under his feet. The goods could do the selling, if the price was plain and the goods were within reach. The next spring, 1879, with borrowed goods and borrowed nerve, he opened his own store in Utica, New York, the great 5-cent store. It did well for a few weeks, faded as the novelty wore off a side street location, and quietly died. most stories would end there. His very nearly did. But that same June, he tried once more, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on a better street, in a town that took to him. And by some accounts, the little store sold over $100 worth of goods on its first day. Lancaster lived. Soon he added a second price, 10 cents, and the 5 and 10 was born entire. One store became a handful, a brother here, a cousin there, trusted friends from the Watertown days, each seeding their own towns. The failure in Utica taught him about location. The success in Lancaster taught him about everything else. 34 years later, the lantern in this stockroom is one of hundreds moving in the dark across the continent at this exact hour, in towns whose names the founder has never heard. The stock boy stacks the last of the crates, chalks the bin numbers, and hauls the first baskets of goods toward the sales floor. Upstairs, the sky over Main Street is beginning to gray. At 7, the counter girls arrive. They come in 2s and 3s along the waking street, past the milk wagons and the first shopkeepers cranking down their awnings. Young women, most of them somewhere between 16 and 25, in shirtwaists and long dark skirts, hair pinned up under plain hats, coats too thin for the season's last cold mornings. They are mill workers' daughters and farmers' daughters and the daughters of immigrants. Some are the first women in their families ever to work indoors, in a dry place, among clean goods. At the side door, they say good morning to the stock boy, hang their coats on the row of hooks, and take their stations, one girl to a counter, each with her small kingdom of bins to govern. The work before opening has a rhythm the manuals spell out and the memories confirm. Counters uncovered and the dust cloths folded away. Goods brought up from the stockroom to fill yesterday's gaps. Because a Woolworth counter was never to look picked over, abundance was part of the spell. Price signs squared. The glass dividers between the bins wiped until they disappear. The brass fittings of the register rub bright. By some accounts, in many stores, the morning ended with an inspection, the manager walking the aisles, and store lore says that in the strictest houses he walked them wearing white gloves, drawing a fingertip along the shelf edges, looking for the dust that meant a counter girl had cut a corner. Whether every manager owned such gloves, the standard was real. The customer, whoever she was to be received like company. Let us say one honest thing here quietly, because it belongs in any true accounting of this fortune. And then let us give these young women the dignity of their day. They were paid very little. A counter girl in 1913 might earn a few dollars a week, 5 or 6 in a big city, less in a small town, and the reform commissions of that very decade heard testimony in public hearings that such wages were not enough for a woman to live on alone. The founder himself, in one much-quoted letter from the early years, had told his managers with uncomfortable frankness that the whole system of low prices depended on keeping wages low. That sentence is part of the arithmetic of the nickel, just as surely as the crates and the cash registers, and it should be entered in the ledger plainly, without flinching. The bargains America carried home from these counters were subsidized in part by the young women standing behind them. And yet, and both things are true at once, which is how history usually arranges matters, the girls themselves did not generally tell their story as a lament. For a great many of them, the dime store was the best door open. Better than the mill, better than the laundry, better than service in someone else's kitchen. The store was warm and bright and social. There was talk between customers and the small pride of a counter kept perfectly, and the society of the other girls, and for some a slow ladder, head of counter, then the cash desk, then, in time, forewoman over the floor. They knew the stock the way a librarian knows shelves. Ask for hairpins, mousetraps, a doll's tea set, a valentine, and the girl at the notions counter could lay her hand on it without looking down. By 8:30 the store is ready, and there is a moment. Every retail worker in every century has known it, when the work pauses and the place stands complete, every bin full, every sign straight, the sunlight coming through the gold letters on the front windows and landing on the oiled floor, the whole long room smelling of candy and floor oil and fresh cardboard, silent, waiting. The counter girls straighten their cuffs. At 9 o'clock, the manager unlocks the double doors, and the real day, the day all of this exists for, walks in off Main Street. To understand what those customers were walking into, you have to remember for a moment what shopping had been before. In the old dry goods store, the goods lived behind the counter and the clerk lived in front of them, and nothing happened without conversation. You asked. The clerk fetched. The clerk suggested. The price was often whatever the clerk judged you could pay, and the haggling was expected, and the credit ledger under the counter knew your family's name and your family's debts. To walk into a store was to be seen, measured, and attended to. If your purse was thin, every step of it could be a small humiliation. Now watch what happens at 9 o'clock in the 5 and 10, because it is one of the quietest revolutions in American life. The doors open, and the customers, housewives with market baskets, old men, school children who should be leaving for school and are not, walk in, and nobody attends to them at all. That was the miracle. Everything in the store lies out in the open, on waist-high counters, in bins tilted toward the aisle. Nothing is behind glass. Nothing is behind anything. You may pick up the china dog, turn it over, feel its weight, and set it down again, and no one will approach you, and no one will ask your intentions, and the price is written on a sign in letters everyone can read, and it is the same price for the banker's wife and the mill hand's daughter. 5 cents or 10. No haggling, because there is nothing to haggle about. No credit, so no ledger knows your name. No shame anywhere in the building. People needed a while to believe it. The early stores, the old clerks remembered, drew customers who circled the counters with their hands clasped behind their backs, waiting to be pounced on. When no pounce came, something in their shoulders let go. You could simply look. Browsing, that whole idle, pleasant, modern habit of being among goods without owing anyone an explanation, was invented more or less at these counters. The store asked nothing of you. And precisely because it asked nothing, you stayed. And because you stayed, sooner or later the nickel came out of the glove. Listen to the room as the morning fills it. The screen doors spring, the bins clicking softly as hands stir through them, and every minute or so the bright ring of a brass cash register, the store's own church bell, and the drawers rattle and slide. At the candy counter nearest the door, deliberately nearest the door, a girl weighs out penny candy into paper sacks for children who have been calculating all week. Lemon drops, whorehound, licorice whips, chocolate babies. The founder had insisted on candy up front from the earliest days. The smell alone, the stories say, was worth a clerk's wages. Farther in, at the music counter of the bigger stores, a hired pianist plays through the sheet music on sale, and shoppers stand and listen to the season's songs for nothing, and the 16-year-olds linger. Toys, tinware, glassware, stationery, hair ribbons by the mile. And on the signs everywhere, the same two numbers over and over, like a rhyme. A nickel in 1913 was not nothing, call it somewhere near $1.50 of our money by some accounts, but it was a sum nearly everyone could hold. That was the founder's deepest insight, and it is worth saying softly at this hour. He was not selling to the rich, and he was not, in the way of the old charity bazaars, condescending to the poor. He had priced dignity itself at 5 cents. A scrub woman could walk out of his store with a glass dish that caught the light on her windowsill exactly the way Crystal caught it on Fifth Avenue. Millions of American kitchens were furnished, cup by cup, out of these bins. The 5 and 10 made a small, real luxury out of the act of buying, and it never once asked the customer who she was. By late morning, the aisles are full, the registers are ringing their steady Angelus, and the nickels are beginning to pile up in the drawers. The day's first 1,000 of them on their way, though nobody in the store thinks of it this way, to Manhattan and to a tower. because at noon, the Empire's other rooms come into the story. Somewhere in New York, the men who feed all 600 of these stores are going to lunch late, and we are going with them. Noon in Lower Manhattan. In the general offices of the F.W. Woolworth Company, this spring, in the last weeks before the whole operation moves into the new tower, the morning mail has come in from 600 managers, and the buyers are at their desks among the samples. It is to look at the least romantic room in the Empire: roll-top desks, sample cases, invoices on spindles, men in shirt sleeves comparing a 6-penny tumbler to a 5-cent tumbler under the window light. But this room is the engine. This is where the nickel is squeezed. The squeezing worked like this, and the method was the founders from the beginning. First, buy for cash, always. A factory quoted one price to a merchant who wanted terms and credit, and a better one to a man who paid on the spot, and Woolworth always paid on the spot. Second, buy enormously. An order from this office could keep a pottery or a tin stamping works running for a season, and a factory facing an order like that would cut its price to the bone rather than lose it. Third, and this was the refinement the trade came to marvel at, do not simply buy what the factories make. Tell them what to make. The buyers worked backward from the nickel. Decide the customer will pay 5 cents for a tumbler, subtract freight and the store's small margin, and then sit down with the glassworks and design a tumbler that could be made, profitably, for what remained. The 5 and 10 did not just sell goods cheap. It reached up the whole chain of manufacture and redesigned the goods around the coin. And once a year, for more than 20 years now, the founder had done his own reaching across the ocean. Beginning in 1890, Frank Woolworth sailed to Europe on buying trips that became legend in the trade, through England, France, Germany, Austria, notebook in hand, buying direct from the workshops and cutting out every importer and middleman in between. In the German toy villages, he found dolls and marbles and tin soldiers at prices that made him, by his own account in letters home, nearly giddy. And in the mountain town of Lauscha, he found the blown glass Christmas ornaments, bought a consignment half on faith, the stories say, and watched them vanish from the counters in days. Within a decade, he was taking the output of whole villages, and it is fair to say, by some accounts, that the American habit of the ornamented Christmas tree, the glass balls in their thin nested boxes, one cracked one in every family set, came across the Atlantic in Woolworth crates. There is one more thing to know about the company whose lunch hour we are sharing, and it is the gentlest fact in the whole mechanical chapter. The F.W. Woolworth Company, as it existed on our Tuesday, was barely a year old, formed in 1912 when 6 chains of 5 and 10s merged into one. And the 6 were not strangers circling each other with lawyers. They were friends. The founder's own brother, who had built his stores out of Scranton. His cousin out of Buffalo. 2 old colleagues from the Watertown store, where he had once worked for nothing, men who had learned the trade at the next counter over. And the 6th was his old employer himself, the merchant who had given an awkward farm boy his first chance, taken into the empire that grew from that kindness. Something like 600 stores came together under one name and went to the stock exchange, and the men who had spent 30 years as friendly rivals trading advice and store locations the whole while ended as directors at one table. The combined stores that year were ringing up sales of somewhere around $60 million, and at a nickel and a dime a time, sit with what that means. Not $60 million, but 1 billion small transactions and more, 1 billion separate moments of someone deciding a thing was worth 1 coin. No fortune in America had ever been built out of pieces this small. It was as if someone had found a way to dam a river made entirely of drizzle. The buyers go back to their tumblers. The mailboys sort the 600 envelopes. And a few blocks south, where Broadway meets City Hall Park, the thing the drizzle paid for stands nearly finished against the spring sky. It is 3 o'clock. Let us go and look at it. You would have heard it before you saw it that spring. The riveting hammers, high up, tapping against the sky like distant woodpeckers. And then you come out of the narrow streets into the open of City Hall Park, and there it is, and like everyone else on the sidewalk, you stop walking and tip your head back and back and back. The Woolworth building in the April of 1913 is for all practical purposes complete. The scaffolding down, the last terracotta set, the tenants beginning to move in floor by floor. It stands on Broadway, filling the block between Park Place and Barclay Street, and it rises 792 feet, 57 floors by the usual count, which makes it, by a comfortable margin, the tallest inhabited building human beings have ever constructed. Nothing on earth but a French iron tower stands taller, and that, New Yorkers like to point out, was scaffolding with a view, not a building where people worked. And here is the wonder that stopped the sidewalk crowds, then and for decades after. It does not look like a monument to arithmetic. The architect Cass Gilbert had clothed the steel in cream-colored terracotta, fired clay, cast in molds light as pastry compared to stone, and he had styled the whole shaft in the manner of the great Gothic cathedrals, pointed arches, pinnacles, tracery like stone lace, gargoyles, a crown of green copper roofs far up in the weather. Gothic, Gilbert understood, was the one language of building whose every line points upward, so the eye catches the vertical piers at the sidewalk and runs all the way to the crown without once being told to stop. On gray days, the top floors stand in the fog, and the terracotta goes pearl-colored, and the building looks less like commerce than like something a quiet order of monks might have raised, given 60 stories and an elevator. A popular minister of the day, walking up to it as the morning sun caught the crown, called it the Cathedral of Commerce, and the name held, because everyone could see it was simply true. Inside, past the great arched portal, the lobby glows like a reliquary, a vaulted ceiling of gold mosaic, marble the color of honey brought from a Greek island, a stained glass skylight over the marble stair. And up in the shadows of the crossing, where a medieval mason would have carved saints, the carvers of this cathedral were allowed their joke, and it is a gentle one. Among the corbels are little caricatures, the architect cradling a model of the building in his arms like an infant. And the founder, Frank Woolworth himself, in fired plaster, hunched and grinning, counting out nickels into his palm. He could afford the joke. And here is the fact about this building that everyone in 1913 knew, the fact that made it not merely tall but astonishing. Frank Woolworth paid for it in cash. Roughly $13.5 million by most accounts, and not $1 of it borrowed. No mortgage, no bonds, no bank holding paper over any floor of it. He paid for the tallest building on earth the way customers paid at his counters, the full price, coin on the barrelhead, and walked away owing nothing. Bankers had spent 40 years declining to take the nickel business seriously. The nickel business had now built, without them, a tower that looked down on every bank in America. Ask why. Why a man who watched pennies would pour 13 million of them into terracotta, and his own answer, the one the trade papers repeated, was the merchant's answer to the end. The tower was a signboard. The best advertisement ever built. A 5 and 10 in a far prairie town gained a little glory from it. Every postcard of the New York skyline now carried his name for free. Beneath the sentiment, as usual with him, the arithmetic was sound. The building was let to tenants floor after floor, and the signboard was designed to pay rent. In a few weeks' time, on an evening in late April, the President of the United States in Washington will press a small button, and 80,000 electric lamps will come on at once through these 57 floors, and the tower will stand over the harbor like a lit lantern, and ships coming in past the Narrows will see it from miles at sea. The couple from Brooklyn strolling the park path below us cannot know it yet, but that light is going to burn over this city for the rest of the century and beyond, long after the last nickel that paid for it has vanished from the last drawer. The founder himself is in the building this afternoon, high up, where the fitters are finishing his private office, a room done at his instruction in green marble and gilt bronze, in the manner of the palace rooms of Napoleon, whom he admired above all men. But he will not stay late today. Toward 5 o'clock, the great man's car turns north, up Broadway, toward Fifth Avenue, and we will ride quietly along, because the day is folding now toward its stranger, softer hours. It is 5 o'clock. The Empire is going home. The house stands on Fifth Avenue at 80th Street, across from the park in the long row of millionaires' houses that the avenue had become, a gray stone pile in the French taste with a porte-cochere and tall iron gates. Frank Woolworth had built it a decade or so before, when the nickels had finally unanswerably added up. Inside, the rooms are everything the 5 and 10 was not. A dining room walled in marble and warmed with gold leaf tapestries, painted ceilings, a marble stair curving up through the quiet. The man who furnished 1 million plain kitchens at 10 cents an item dined, himself under gilt off porcelain, and there is no scandal in that, only the old human seesaw. He had been cold and poor on a farm for 21 years. He spent the rest of his life making sure the rooms were warm and nothing in them was cheap. He filled the house with Napoleon. That was the private weather of the man. Portraits and busts of the emperor, relics and furniture in the Empire style. His bedroom, by the accounts of those who saw it, was modeled on Napoleon's own at the Palace of Compiègne. The trade papers found it amusing, the dime store Napoleon, but stand inside the logic for a moment and it is not so strange. Napoleon was history's great organizer, the man who took 1 million ordinary soldiers, ordinary supply wagons, ordinary small units, and assembled them into something that moved as one. A man who had built an empire from 5-cent pieces, 600 stores marching to one set of orders, might be forgiven for feeling the kinship. He owned no yachts and cared nothing for racehorses. His one extravagance was an emperor. But the house had another tenant, and now the evening grows tender, so let us lower our voices. His wife, Jenny, was there, the seamstress who had married him back in 1876 when he was nobody, a failed clerk with red hands and who had stitched and saved beside him through the lean Lancaster years. Together they had raised 3 daughters. And by our Tuesday in 1913, Jenny's mind was leaving her. The doctors of that age had a cruel, helpless name for it. Premature senility, they said, and no treatment at all. She moved through the marble rooms with her nurses, gently, recognizing less and less. Not the gold ceilings, not on the hardest days, the man whose whole improbable rise she alone had witnessed from the very first counter. Everything he had built, he could no longer tell her about. It is the fact about Frank Woolworth's grand years that the trade papers never printed, and it explains more about the man in the evenings than the Napoleon ever did. The daughters were grown and married now, households of their own in the city, money settled on each. And in one of those households that spring there was a baby, a granddaughter, a few months old, born the previous November, named Barbara. On our Tuesday, she is asleep in a nursery somewhere uptown, unremarkable as any infant. Hold her name gently. We will meet her again on the far side of the day, and the whole last act of this story will be hers. After dinner, and this happened on real evenings, often enough that guests wrote it down in wonder, the lights in the great hall would sink, and the founder would seat himself at the console of the enormous pipe organ he had built into the house. Here is the loveliest, saddest, most human detail in all the Woolworth papers. He could not play. He had no training at all. The organ was a mechanical marvel that played itself from perforated rolls, the finest self-playing instrument money could buy, and Frank Woolworth sat at its console while it thundered, hands on the keys, master of the performance the way a boy is master of a river he stands beside. And he had gone further, the accounts say. The hall was rigged with hidden colored lights so that as the organ stormed through Wagner or a Requiem, artificial lightning flickered along the ceiling, thunder rolled from the low pipes, and portraits of the great composers glowed out of the darkness one by one, watching. Dinner guests sat in the flickering dark, politely astonished, while their host, 60 years old, the most successful merchant on earth, conducted his private tempest. You may smile at that. The guests sometimes did, carefully, on the way home. But listen to it again, at this hour of the night, and it lands differently. A farm boy who was told he could not sell. A wife who no longer knew the evenings were grand. A house full of gold in which, past a certain hour, there was no one at all to talk to. The organ filled the marble rooms with something on the nights when nothing else could. Every empire we have ever visited by candlelight has somewhere near its center a room like this one, enormous, magnificent, and lonely. This one merely came with its own thunder. And one more small thing, since the evening is being honest with us. The founder loved his table, the heavy dinners, the rich desserts of a man making up for a hungry boyhood, and he had all his life one fear he could not price away. He was terrified of dentists. He would not see them. When his teeth ached, he endured and ate his soft, rich food and put it off and put it off. It seems a small thing to mention in a marble hall, hardly worth a sentence. Hold it gently all the same. It is not a small thing. It is how this particular empire loses its emperor. Downtown, the store lights are going out. Let us leave the mansion to its organ and go back to Main Street, where a watchman is buttoning his coat. The store closed at 6. By 7, the counter girls were home to their boarding houses and family suppers. The registers were empty, and the manager had done the day's last and most sacred office, alone at his desk in the back with the door locked. The counting. Picture the desk under its green-shaded lamp. The take from every register sorted and stacked, the dimes in their slim piles and the nickels, the endless nickels, in towers and rows, counted twice and rolled into paper sleeves. On a decent Tuesday in a decent town, a store like this one might ring up something like $300, which sounds modest until you do what the manager never bothered to do anymore. And translate it, 5,000 or 6,000 separate coins, 5,000 or 6,000 separate decisions, passed hand to hand across the counters since 9 o'clock this morning. The figures go into the ledger in a careful hand. The ledger's totals go into the weekly letter to New York. The coins themselves go into the canvas deposit bag, and tomorrow morning into the town bank. Multiply this small green-lit scene by 600 towns, tonight and every night, and you have, by some accounts, close to $200,000 a day flowing quietly toward the company's accounts. A river 4 million coins wide, audited nightly by tired men in shirt sleeves, in the back rooms of Main Street, by lamplight. Now it is 8, and the store belongs to the watchman. He lets himself in at the side door and begins the round he will walk and the hour until morning. And if you want to know what an empire feels like from the very inside, this is it. So let us walk one round with him and then leave the day's working world behind. The lantern first, or in the newer stores, the electric hand lamp, and then the long walk up the first aisle. The floor creaks in the places it always creaks. The counters lie under their muslin covers like furniture in a summer house, and under the cloth the bins hold their thousands of small things in the dark. The hairpins, the tin soldiers, the teacups, the valentines, everything waiting, everything at 5 and 10. The smells have settled and deepened now that the crowds are gone. Floor oil, candy, the cold iron smell of the stove at the back. At the stations along his route, the watchman turns his key in the small recording clock he carries, a dime store empire trusted, but it also verified, and the clock's paper dial takes the print of the hour. Furnace checked and banked. Back door bolted. Front locks tried. Through the gold letters on the dark front windows, the arc lamp on the corner throws its light across the floorboards, and Main Street stands empty, and somewhere a dog, and somewhere a late wagon, and that is all. There is something in a closed store at night that even the watchmen, practical men, sometimes remarked on. All day the place is noise and hands and small commerce, and then for 10 hours it is a still room full of 10,000 patient objects, the whole modest inventory of American desire waiting under cloth. The watchman finishes his round and settles by the stove with his supper pail. His wages, his lantern oil, his recording clock, all of it is a line in a ledger in New York, part of the cost of the nickel, part of the machine. He would not put it this way. He would say he minds the store. And 400 miles away at this same hour, the man whose name is on the window glass is sitting at a pipe organ in a marble hall, making thunder. The empire at 8 o'clock is these two rooms at once, and it is held together by nothing more than arithmetic and trust, coin by coin, key station by key station, town by town, night after ordinary night. One appointment remains in our imagined day, and it is the one we have been saving. It requires us to go back to Manhattan and upward. It is nearly midnight, and the tallest building on earth does not entirely sleep. Let us allow ourselves at the end of this long day the one full liberty of our reconstruction. The records will forgive us, and the view is worth it. It is midnight, and we are rising through the dark heart of the Woolworth building, in one of the high-speed elevators that are themselves among the wonders of the age, up past the sleeping floors of the sleeping tenants, past the fitters' ladders and the smell of new paint and marble dust, up to where the Gothic crown stands in the night wind, 6 stories over the Black Harbor. The founder brought guests up this way in the building's first years, and an observation gallery near the crown would soon make the pilgrimage ordinary. Tonight, in our imagining, the platform is ours. Step out carefully and look. Below and everywhere, New York at midnight, 1913. The street lamps stitch their long seams up the island. The elevated trains, small as toys, drag their strings of lit windows along 6th Avenue and 9th. The two great bridges to Brooklyn hang their necklaces of lights over the East River, and a third stands nearly ready beside them. Ferries cross the black water trailing sparks of lantern light, and beyond the Narrows, where the harbor opens to the sea, a late liner stands in toward Quarantine, decks lit, bringing its steerage full of futures. Somewhere below us, unlit and unnoticed, is the little churchyard where the city buried its dead when Broadway was a cowpath. From this height, the whole roaring city is silent, just lights and the wind and the cold, clean smell of the upper air. Face west and north, out over the dark continent, and think of what is out there tonight, all of it his. 600 darkened stores on 600 main streets. 600 watchmen turning 600 keys. The rolled nickels sleeping in the canvas bags. The counter girls asleep in their boarding house rooms, the stock boys, the buyers, the managers with their green-shaded lamps. The entire quiet machinery of the largest small change enterprise in the history of the world, resting between one ordinary day and the next. 34 years ago this spring, a young man stood in a failing store in Utica and watched his first great idea die on a side street. Tonight the idea stands 792 feet over Broadway, paid in full, and its light will shortly be visible from the sea. This is the top, not just of the tower, of the whole story. Hold the moment a little, the way you hold the last warm minute before sleep. Every empire has one night like this, though almost no one ever knows it at the time. The night when the arc has reached its highest point and everything built still stands and nothing has yet begun to slip. Our Tuesday, chosen from all the days, is such a night. And because this is a quiet story, and because you are safe and warm and half asleep, we can let the future into it now, gently, like a draft under a door. 6 years from tonight, in the April of 1919, the founder will die. It will not be a dramatic death, only a foolish and human one. An infected tooth of all small things, the old terror of dentists holding him back from care until the poison passed beyond care's reach. A few days of decline in his great house on Long Island, and then, 5 days short of his 67th birthday, the end. The man who counted everything will leave, by some accounts, roughly $65 million. Some reckonings run it closer to 76, and no updated will, so that the whole of it passes to Jenny, his Jenny, who by then cannot be told what she has inherited, or from whom. The empire of nickels, built by one man's arithmetic, will sail on without him under salaried captains bigger every year, into a century that will slowly, without malice, take all of it back. But that is tomorrow's weather and tomorrow's. Tonight the lamps burn, the ledgers balance, and the tower stands new under the stars. Come down now gently, floor by floor, and let the elevator doors close behind us. Our one imagined day is over, every hour of it spent. What remains of this story happened after, in the long years when no single day could hold it. We will tell it the way the night tells things, slowly and kindly and mostly in the dark. Remember the baby, asleep uptown on the evening of our Tuesday. Barbara. She is the thread the rest of the fortune follows, so let us follow it with her, and let us agree before we start on the spirit of the telling. Her story has been told for 90 years with a smirk, and it has never once deserved one. We will tell it with compassion, because compassion is what the record, read quietly, actually asks for. The sorrows began early, and they were not of her making. Her mother, Edna, the founder's middle daughter, died suddenly in a suite at the Plaza Hotel in the spring of 1917 at 33. The family said very little then, and out of the same mercy we will say very little now. Barbara was 4 years old. 2 years later, her grandfather was gone. 5 years after that, her grandmother Jenny, and the great fortune came down through the trusts like water finding a child at the bottom of a well. Barbara's share, held for her minority, was invested shrewdly through the boom years, and by her 21st birthday in 1933, it had grown, by some accounts, to roughly $50 million. This in the hardest year of the Great Depression, when a fifth of the country could find no work at all. The newspapers never forgave her the timing. Her debutante ball in 1930, $60,000 of orchids and orchestras, by the paper's count, while breadlines lengthened outside, fixed her image before she was old enough to have formed one of her own, and the press coined the name that followed her to the end, the poor little rich girl. And the cruelty of the name is that it was simply accurate on both ends. She was very rich and she was very poor in everything the money could not reach. A motherless child raised by relays of governesses and relatives, moved from house to house, taught by everyone around her that the fortune was the most interesting thing about her. She spent the rest of her life among people who, with a handful of loyal exceptions, agreed. She married 7 times. The bare list has fed gossip for decades, but listen to the shape of it instead. Princes real and doubtful, a count, a diplomat, a baron, a playboy, and in the middle of them, one film star, Cary Grant, who signed away every claim to her money before the wedding, took nothing when it ended, and remained her friend for life, which tells you what she might have found more of, in a kinder world. Several of the others arrived with titles and left with settlements. One, by many accounts, treated her brutally. She gave and gave, that was the pattern under all of it. Palaces in Tangier and Mexico. A great house built in London and later given to the American government, which houses its ambassadors there to this day. Jewels that had belonged to queens pressed into the hands of friends and, the stories say, sometimes into the hands of strangers who had merely been kind to her that afternoon. Money had come to her without love often enough that she seems to have concluded, somewhere very deep, that giving it away was the closest she could come to being loved without buying it. Her health failed by inches, the sleeplessness, the not eating, the medicines of that era that made everything worse. Her only child, a son, was killed in the crash of a small plane in 1972, and after that, those close to her said, something simply stopped trying. Barbara Hutton died in Los Angeles in the spring of 1979 at 66, very nearly the age at which her grandfather had died. Of the tens of millions that had come down to her from the nickels and the counters, there remained by some accounts a few $1,000s. The fortune that Frank Woolworth had assembled 5 cents at a time across 40 years of dawns and stockrooms had passed through 3 generations and returned very nearly to zero. Not stolen, not crashed, but spent, given, married away, and grieved away, one glittering, unhappy handful at a time. She asked near the end to be remembered gently. Let us at least tonight be among the ones who do. The stores themselves outlived the family fortune, and for a long while they seemed as permanent as the towns they stood in. The 1,000th store had opened while the founder was still alive. Through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the red and gold signs multiplied across America and Britain, Canada, and Germany until, by some accounts, there were more than 4,000 of them, and the company could fairly call itself the largest chain of stores on earth. And somewhere in those years, the 5 and 10 grew its warmest institution, the lunch counter, the long line of chrome stools where a town met itself at noon, over grilled cheese and coffee and cherry coke served fast and cheap under the ceiling fans. One of those counters belongs to the history of the country itself, and it deserves its own quiet sentence here. On the 1st of February 1960, 4 young black college students sat down at the whites-only lunch counter of the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, were refused service and politely declined to leave. And the sit-ins that began there spread city by city until the counters, and far more than the counters, were open to everyone. A section of that Greensboro counter rests today in the Smithsonian, which is exactly where it belongs. The decline, when it came the way it always comes in these stories, not through a villain, but through the world-changing shape. The customers bought cars and followed the new highways out to the suburbs, and Main Street, the empire's one indispensable partner, began its long, quiet emptying. The malls rose and the discount giants rose with them, some of them, in the fullness of irony, founded by dime store men who had simply read the new weather faster. And inflation, patient as tide, dissolved the very idea at the company's heart. By the 60s, nothing in America cost a nickel anymore, least of all in a 5 and 10, and the famous name over the door slowly became a description of nothing. The company fought after its fashion, new formats, new ventures, a discount chain of its own that it finally closed in the early 80s. The stores grew old, the fixtures grew old, the customers who loved them grew old together with them. In 1993, the company closed hundreds of its remaining American 5 and 10s, and then in July of 1997 came the announcement everyone had known was coming, and no one quite believed. The last 400 American Woolworth stores would close. That summer, in town after town, people who had not shopped there in years came in one final time and stood in the aisles, oddly moved, buying a last bag of candy, telling the clerks, many of whom had worked those floors for decades, what the store had meant to a childhood 50 years gone. And then the registers rang out for the last time, and the lights went off, and the sign came down, and the 5 and dime passed altogether into memory. The name survived in one odd, dignified little footnote of corporate genealogy. The company itself did not dissolve. It kept its most successful remaining division, changed its name, and trades to this day as Foot Locker. So that somewhere inside every branded shoebox at the mall there is, if you trace the papers all the way back, a 5-cent counter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1879. The British stores, long since a separate company, carried the old name another decade, until 2008. And then that too was done. And yet, walk out into the world tomorrow and the empire is still there, scattered quiet, hiding in the plainest sight, the way the past prefers to travel. The tower still stands. On Broadway, facing City Hall Park, the Woolworth building keeps its corner of the sky exactly where we left it at midnight. No longer the tallest in the world, not since 1930, but still, by common consent, among the most beautiful things Americans have ever built. The terracotta still goes pearl-colored in fog. The crown is lit at night, and people on the harbor still see it. In the lobby, up in the shadows where the carvers were allowed their joke, the little plaster founder is still counting his nickels into his palm, and he has not lost count once in 100 years. High in the tower where the buyers once squeezed pennies, people now simply live. The Cathedral of Commerce ended up, like most cathedrals, outlasting the faith that raised it and finding new congregations. In Greensboro, the old store is a civil rights museum now, and the lunch counter, the part that did not go to the Smithsonian, is still there, chrome and stools and all, teaching. In London, ambassadors live in Barbara's house, and state dinners are held under the roof her unhappiness paid for. In Lancaster, the town remembers, as towns do, that the whole thing started there. And every December, on trees in living rooms across America, the glass ornaments come out of their thin nested boxes. One cracked one in every family set, and almost nobody hanging them knows they are hanging the cargo of a merchant's crates from Lauscha, or that the whole glittering habit came across the ocean because a man who could not sell believed a nickel was money. The word survives too. Five and dime store, it floats through old songs and old movies, a soft word now, meaning something small and cheap and half-remembered and somehow kind. Languages keep what mattered. And in a jar on a dresser somewhere in nearly every American house, there are nickels tonight. The coin itself, worth almost nothing now, unspendable, saved anyway. Every one of them was once the key to the brightest store on Main Street. Some of the older ones, if coins could remember, have been through those brass registers and were counted under a green-shaded lamp and rode in a canvas bag to a small-town bank and helped in their millionth part to raise a Gothic tower over Broadway. So let it all settle now, gently, wherever it wants to settle. The lantern in the stockroom, the crates of German glass, the counter girls with their cuffs straightened, the ring of the registers, the pianist at the music counter, the terracotta in the fog, the organ making thunder in the marble hall, the watchman's key turning in his clock, the lights of the tower burning out over the dark harbor. If you are still awake, you have spent one whole day inside a vanished empire, from its first lantern to its last light, and you know now how it rose and how it worked, and how coin by coin and year by year it slipped away. Everything gone except the beauty, which is, you may have noticed by now, how nearly all of these stories end. And if you are drifting, half in and half out, letting the words blur into the dark, that is exactly as it should be. That is what this hour is for. The doors are locked. The counters are covered. The day's nickels are all counted, every last one, and the watchman is by his stove, and the store is quiet till morning. Thank you for spending this evening with me by candlelight in the empire of small change. Sleep well. Good night.